Last time I was back in England, I visited the Lake District in the northwest part of the country, this beautiful part of the country. I was with a couple of friends from the seminary. It's really, a very rural place. There's no public transport, so we had to rent a car. And I made a deal with my friends. As the only one of us who had learned to drive on the left, I was driving. Their job, whenever we left a parking lot or a driveway, was to yell at me, left, 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 so I wouldn't forget and turn onto the wrong side. It's very easy when you're in the flow of traffic, but when there's nothing around you, you're setting off to make a decision. Supposedly, the origins of the British driving on the left was that it goes back to medieval days. The roads were traveled on horseback, and since people are mostly right-handed, if you found the enemy coming towards you, you had to be able to reach across yourself in your scabbard and pull out your sword so you could attack them on the right. And then the US drives on the right, supposedly as a protest to British colonialism. I don't know if that's true or not. It makes a good story, so why spoil the details? Our society couldn't make it without these kinds of conventions. Laws that just make things logically work. Legal conventions that seem arbitrary, but it's important that we're all doing the same thing if it's going to work out. God's law, on the other hand, is much more than a matter of convention. God's commands are anything but arbitrary. Love, St. Paul says, is the fulfillment of the law. The one who loves will unquestioningly obey God's law. Not just so that our society works, although that is a part of it, but also so that we are all brought together closer into a greater share of God's glory. God's law expresses the love that is intrinsic to the heart of God. And so to imitate God is to love like Him. Can we ever really love like God? Well, no, but if we are able to do that, if we were, then the commandments would seem less like demands placed upon us and more like descriptors of us. Less "you shall not," and more like "this is what you are, what you are not doing." We would never trouble the law. We would just instinctively behave that way because love would be our only motivation for our actions. Personally, I'm not there yet. I'm not at that point where my motives are always guided by sharing God's mind and God's heart. My pride gets in the way. The cliche that pride is the root of all sin, well, it really is. Pride is not devoid of love, but it is misplaced love. It is self-focused love. Those wristbands, those WWJD wristbands people were wearing a lot in the 90s, I always feel, what would Jesus do? It would be improved a little if they had another A and a W on the end. What would Jesus do and why? Maybe that would remind us that He always acted out of love. Always. Everything He did was out of love. Jesus was never afraid to correct people when they acted wrongly. In today's gospel, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. You and him alone. How does that read in today's context? When you turn on the news and half the stories are about people saying that they've been offended in some way by another group or another person, publicly saying so. A public shaming of those that we believe are in the wrong is considered today to be the moral high ground. How did that happen? How is it that people turn to social media, to Facebook, to hurl insults at other people, criticism of anyone that they disagree with? Even the so-called Catholic blogs. It's insidious and it's toxic. Of course, it's not new either. People have treated their enemies in this way for thousands of years. The methods have changed, but that's exactly what the Romans were doing to Jesus when they forced him to carry his own cross through the streets and publicly humiliate him. They made a spectacle of him. Those who were afraid and challenged by Jesus appealed to the law. civil law to put him to death. It was a human law. It was a law of convention, a law that insisted on the cooperation of the people with an occupying empire. God's law demands justice and demands love, which is at the heart of what Jesus was teaching. And even though speaking of these things would cost him his life, he knew that that was what his Father had sent him to do, to preach the truth and to do it out of love always, to call God's wayward people back to him. The word and the warnings of all God's prophets met in Jesus Christ. God's people repeatedly refused to listen to his prophets until finally he sent his only Son to be what the Lord, speaking through Ezekiel, calls a watchman for the house of Israel. The Lord tells Ezekiel that if he does not speak up to dissuade the people who are doing evil, to dissuade them from their ways, well then the evil will die for their wickedness, but he, Ezekiel, will be responsible for their demise. He has a duty toward his fellow men to warn them. But if he warns them, and they refuse to repent and to change, well then they will suffer the consequences. But Ezekiel will be absolved of any guilt because he's done his duty. God converts hearts, not us. But he does send us as his missionaries. We are responsible for each other's welfare. God's message of reconciliation with him has been entrusted into Jesus' hands and now into our hands. Remember that God gave the 10 Commandments by first reminding the Israelites, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, my laws are not arbitrary. Remember how I loved you. Remember what I've done for you, that I didn't leave you where you were, trapped in slavery. I didn't make you be slaves, and so I'm going to give you these instructions, these commandments, so that you may remain free, so you won't fall back into slavery. That's the purpose of God's law. Today, and in this election year especially, with all the protests and the riots that we've seen, there's such a focus on the civil law and calling out injustice. And while injustice is wrong, for sure, have we made an idol of the law? The way to true justice is certainly not to insult and to hurt others. The wrong way to find justice is to try to correct others out of reverence of the law itself. Resentment and using it to correct others is a dangerous trap. Maybe because they seem to be getting away with something that we haven't been able to, or because there's just some injustice that has been done to us. That resentment leads to anger, which leads to further resentment and hatred. The only motivation for correction needs to be love. To correct because the transgression itself is harming the transgressor themselves. Because we love them and we don't want harm to come to them. There must be a desire to heal rather than to harm. And if you don't have that desire to heal, to help somebody, then don't correct them. The desire to heal is an expression of love for another. It shows respect for the dignity of another, and without that, there is only pride, which can never love perfectly. We're not responsible for someone else's rejection of God's commandments if they refuse to listen to the words of correction spoken in genuine love. But we are responsible for calling each other to be better, to follow the Lord, to be truly free people who live in God's grace and in his love. We are responsible for their fall from his grace if we fail in our Christian duty to care for them and for their eternal salvation.